Okay, guys, so we left off talking about the sort of coalition that occurred right after the 1959 elections that resulted in a partnership between the MPC and the NCNC, and the resulting collapse and fragmentation of the AGP and what happens over in the western region in the Yoruba areas of Nigeria. So, what this does ultimately is it leads to a push by many people, particularly in the Western region, for the potential creation of more states. And that the idea being that with more states, you could have a better representation of individual ethnic groups. But what this would do would be essentially to further decentralize the power of the country as a whole. As a result of this, there were some serious problems in Parliament. The NPC, the Northern Party, they particularly objected because it would mean that they would lose potentially their majority in the House of Representatives. And this also sets the stage for an increased amount of ethnic conflict. And this is really what occurs starting in the middle of the 1960s. So in the middle of the 1960s, essentially what we start with is this British parliamentary style democracy. Yeah, it's federal, but in terms of the election procedures, etc., it's fairly parliamentary, and actually they had a prime minister. But ultimately, this system of government does not work. And what we see is that at the middle of the 1960s to in through the 1970s, there become more and more ethnic divisions in terms of the party format as well as the federal structure of Nigeria as a whole. What happens here is that you have if you have different ethnic parties associated with each individual, if you have different ethnic groups associated with each individual with each individual political party, then it becomes very difficult to have a large enough majority in the House of Representatives to allow for the creation of a prime minister, which is how they initially worked out of this. And so that was very, very difficult, and it was compounded by the outbreak of civil war down in the southeast of Nigeria between 1967 and 1970. This was called the Biafran Civil War. Biafra was an area dominated by Igbo ethnic groups. And essentially, what occurs is that you have this you have this state of emergency going on. Military rule is consolidated to try and put down the civil war that occurs down in the southeast. And Nigeria falls to its first military ruler, Ironsi. There's a coup d'etat, it's a military dictatorship. And ultimately, he will be assassinated. He'll be assassinated by one of his own generals, excuse me. And this coup d'etat is going to really kind of push for this Igbo group to try and seek full independence from Nigeria and to create a state called Biafra. And it results in a whole lot of destabilization for the Nigerian state. And what you're going to see is if you look over here at, hang on, let me pull up a laser pointer for you. If you look over here at this leadership transition, which you actually have this timeline in your textbook as well, in your in your reading packet. If you look over here, you wind up from about 1960 to 1966, you do have a prime minister, it's a republic, and you've got the basics of a federal system of government kind of working out, but it's a little bit weak. In 1966, there is a military coup d'etat. Ironsi comes into power and is shortly thereafter assassinated. And after that, this is the period during which you have the Biafran Civil War. And that destabilizes things even further. And from 1966 until 1967, you have a second military dictatorship with Yakubu Gowon in charge of Nigeria. He'll be ultimately replaced and then succeeded by another military dictator who will be assassinated, and then another military dictator rises to power, and then finally he'll be replaced by a democratically elected president. But even that president will ultimately be replaced by a military dictator. What we're seeing here is essentially the weakness of democratic institutions, and there's no real stickiness to them. And so remember, we talked about when we have imperial societies frequently, or post-imperial societies, one of the few things that kind of sustains civil society is like and political institutions is the power of the military, and that is why you have these kind of frequent military dictatorships emerge between the middle of the 1960s up until, frankly, about 1999. Um, there was some real concern as to whether or not Nigeria could even kind of weather this incredibly violent and complicated period in the middle of the 1960s to the 1970s. There was a lot of feeling that perhaps that Nigeria should fragment into a number of different states, but the only thing that really kept it together was military rule, and I am not advocating for military rule in the slightest. But military strongmen were kind of the only reasons why Nigeria didn't fragment into a number of different independent West African countries. Now, after a period of military dictators, in 1979, there is a transition to a democratically elected president, and you should note there that we have a different system of government emerging here. Emerging here. So in 1979, we shift to a presidential system in Nigeria rather than a British parliamentary system. Um, both the parliamentary system and the presidential system were victims of a huge number of military coups. And military rule was somewhat stable, but not particularly democratic. There are other trends that we see during this period as well. There's an intensification of ethnic conflict, particularly from the 1970s up to the 1980s. We see a coalition develop between the Hausa and Fulani. They also form a secondary coalition between themselves and the Igbo, and they kind of unite against the Yoruba. So this is a real problem. You wind up with the Hausa and Fulani kind of on one side, and then when they have to, they side with the Igbo, but they do not side with the Yoruba. The Yoruba do not side with the Igbo, and this is going to really increase a lot of tensions in Nigeria. There's also a tendency towards personalized rule, meaning that you have like those military strongmen like Ironsi, who basically rule Nigeria with sort of cult of personality. They reward their followers. They have strong systems of patrimonialism and clientelism that's going on here. The government basically funnels the revenue of the Nigerian state directly into the Nigerian elite who are on their side. So if you wind up with a military leader who's Igbo, chances are the wealth of the nation is going to go into that general ethnic group rather than into, say, like the Yoruba. That's a problem. There's a further intensification of federalism, and here in the U.S. we tend to look at federalism as kind of a good way to do things, and it can be. But what it also does is it decentralizes power, and that can potentially lessen the sense of lessen a sense of national identity, lessen a sense of patriotism, and kind of encourage regional and ethnic divisions. So that can be a real problem. However, even though there was kind of federalism on paper, military leaders really didn't allow for too much local control. So you have to kind of take federalism with a grain of salt, at least up until 1999. But the bigger problem is really this, that there was increasing economic dependence on oil. Now, Nigeria has enormous, enormous oil reserves. They really do, down in the Niger Delta. But the thing is that Nigeria becomes essentially a rentier state. And the only thing that the Nigerian government really put money into in terms of its economic development during, say, the early 80s up to the early 90s was oil production. And that was a problem because they weren't diversifying their economic sort of portfolio. They weren't really thinking about what other things they could improve on. It's never a great idea to have your reliance on one particular economic sector. That can be quite dangerous. Now, so what this means is that Nigeria has become a rentier state. And a rentier state is essentially where you have one major natural resource or one major industry that you essentially rent out the business for. So, like in Nigeria, most of the profits from oil do wind up in Nigeria, a good portion of it. But the oil production itself is largely done by foreign corporations, particularly BP, which is formerly known as British Petroleum. And that means that what happens is you have these foreign corporations that essentially pay a lot to the government to have access to these oil reserves. And they're essentially renting the land and the access to these natural resources in order to make a profit. That's what makes Nigeria a rentier state. We're going to talk about Iran as well, and Iran is also a rentier state. There's also a lot of debt that occurs because there is a significant amount of over reliance on oil and also a lot of corruption in the way that it is distributed. So, for example, here, let me see if I can draw you a little thing. So what happens is frequently what you wind up with is, can I change the color of this? Probably not. All right, you should be able to see that there's a little bit of a triangle over here. What happens is at the top of sort of the distribution pyramid, you have the people at the very top of Nigerian government. And this could be your military leader, or it could be your democratically elected president or the political party around them. And what happens is they are the ones who have access to this resource. They have access to the oil. The oil goes directly to them. And it's they who gets to determine who is going to be in control of all of those resources. And so they distribute everything out, sort of a top-down distributive program. And that means that it's very, very easy since nobody is kind of checking this portion of distribution right here. The oil comes out of the ground, the profits go, where they go, and they wind up in the hands of these top political elites. And there's nobody really checking here. So what you can do is when you get the profits from the oil, you can just kind of send some of it off here to foreign banks. And that's frequently what happens. So there's a lot of potential for corruption in a rentier state because there's a lack of check of power in terms of economic production. So ultimately, what this means is that, yeah, you have a lot of potential wealth in the form of oil, but if a lot of it's being skimmed off the top, and there were several military dictators in the 1970s and 1980s who had massive, Swiss bank accounts and just kind of funneled and siphoned huge amounts of Nigerian oil money out. Ultimately, what occurs is in the 1980s, Nigeria is in a really tough way economically, and they have to turn to international organizations in order to try and get their debt under control. They really need a lot. They need infrastructure and electricity. They need education. They need all sorts of stuff. And they frankly don't have the money for the operating costs in the 1980s. So what they wind up doing is they turn to the World Bank and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. And what the IMF and the World Bank required in the 1980s and still do in order to take out significant loans in less developed nations is something called a structural adjustment program. And a structural adjustment program, as your as your quiz today should have kind of sparked in your brain. It essentially is a program where you have to prove that you are moving towards free market economics. You have to change the way that your government structure is set up to encourage that. You have to change any local laws that would prohibit free market economics. And they had to do things like they had to prove that they were going to try and diversify the Nigerian economy. They were going to try to lessen their dependence on oil. They had to make a show of at least trying to diversify their economy. And to be fair, they did. And that's where we're going to leave off for right now in terms of your video lecture, because that's what I wanted to get to for this. However, what you need to do now is either on your phones or on the class laptops, I need you to go to the class website, and there is a PowerPoint there on Nigerian political institutions, and you need to take notes off of it. Make sure that you have all the information down, be able to tell me about the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of the Nigerian government by the time I see you again. All right, and I will talk to you on Wednesday. See you later, guys.